You think you know someone after years of sharing a bed, raising children, and making plans for the future. But you don't. Not until the moment they rip your world apart with a single sentence. I found someone new. Just like that, everything you've built together, it's gone. And you're left standing there, watching it crumble like dust at your feet. That's how it all started for me. My name's Ethel. Aunt Ethel, if you will. I'm 55 years old, and in all my years, I thought I had everything figured out. My life was a routine. A simple life. Wake up, get dressed, cook a nice dinner, and keep the peace. But the day my husband, my ex-husband now, told me he was leaving me, everything changed. And no, it wasn't the "I'm unhappy" speech you hear in all the movies. No, it was worse. It was in the middle of my own daughter's wedding reception, of all places, in front of everyone. But before I tell you about that night, let me paint you a picture of who I was before everything fell apart. I was the woman who never missed a PTA meeting, who organized every neighborhood barbecue, who remembered everyone's birthdays and anniversaries. I was the one they called when someone needed a casserole for a funeral or help planning a baby shower. I was dependable, predictable, safe. Or so I thought. For 32 years, I lived what I believed was the perfect life. Jim and I met in college. He was studying business. I was getting my teaching degree. We married young, full of dreams about white picket fences and Sunday dinners. I gave up teaching when our first child, Sarah, was born. Then came Michael 2 years later. Jim's career took off, and I became the woman behind the successful man. I threw myself into being the perfect wife and mother. I joined every committee, volunteered at the school, kept our house spotless, and never complained about the long hours Jim worked. When he missed dinner because of a client meeting, I wrapped his plate and left it in the refrigerator with a loving note. When he forgot our anniversary, I reminded him gently and pretended it didn't hurt. I became an expert at making excuses for him, to others and to myself. The signs were all there, looking back now. The late nights that became later, the business trips that seemed to multiply, the way he stopped really looking at me when we talked, like I was just part of the furniture he'd grown used to. The subtle changes in how he dressed, suddenly caring about cologne and new shirts. But I explained it all away. He was working hard for our family. He was under stress. He was just going through a phase. I see now that I was terrified to ask the hard questions, because I already knew the answers. I was afraid that if I pulled at that loose thread, the entire fabric of my life would unravel. So I chose to live in denial, to polish the surface while the foundation rotted underneath. Sarah and Michael grew up, as children do. Sarah became this brilliant, independent young woman, a lawyer like her father had always wanted to be. She found love with David, a kind man who looked at her the way Jim used to look at me, back when we were young and believed in forever. Michael went to college across the country and started his own family. I was proud of them both, but I'll admit, when they left, I felt lost. For years, my identity had been wrapped up in being their mother. I was the one who packed their lunches, helped with homework, drove them to practices and recitals. Suddenly, the house felt enormous and empty. Jim would leave for work before I woke up and come home after I'd already eaten dinner alone. We became strangers living in the same house, going through the motions of a marriage that existed only on paper. But I told myself this was normal. This was what happened to couples after the children left. We just needed to rediscover each other. I planned romantic dinners that he was too tired to enjoy. I suggested weekend getaways that he was too busy to take. I bought new clothes, tried new hairstyles, anything to catch his attention. But he looked through me like I was invisible. That's when I should have known. That's when I should have confronted him. But instead, I threw myself into planning Sarah's wedding. It became my obsession, my purpose. Every detail had to be perfect. The flowers, the dress, the venue, the menu. If I could give my daughter the perfect wedding, maybe it would somehow make everything else perfect too. Sarah's wedding consumed me for months. I spent hours on the phone with caterers and florists, drove across town to look at fabric samples and cake designs. Jim seemed relieved that I had something to occupy my time, though he showed little interest in the details. "Whatever you think is best," he'd say, barely looking up from his laptop. But I didn't mind. I felt useful again, needed. The wedding was going to be beautiful. A garden ceremony at the country club where Jim and I had been members for 15 years. Sarah looked radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, which I'd spent weeks altering to fit her perfectly. 200 guests were coming, including all of Jim's business associates and their wives. I'd planned every seating arrangement, every centerpiece, every moment of the reception. But in the weeks leading up to the wedding, I noticed something odd. Jim seemed nervous, distracted. He'd disappear for hours without explanation, claiming he had wedding-related errands to run. He was secretive about his phone calls, stepping outside or into his study whenever it rang. When I asked about it, he snapped at me, saying I was being paranoid and clingy. There was also Emma, his new secretary, young, beautiful, efficient. She'd started working for him about 6 months earlier. Jim mentioned her frequently, praising her organization skills, her fresh ideas, her dedication to the job. When she called the house, which seemed to happen more and more often, her voice was always bright and familiar, like she knew secrets I wasn't privy to. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I found Jim in his study, on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. When he saw me, he quickly ended the call and claimed it was just a client from the West Coast. But something in his eyes, guilt maybe, or fear, told me otherwise. I asked him directly if everything was okay, if there was something he needed to tell me. He looked right at me and lied. "Everything's fine, Ethel. Tomorrow's going to be perfect." Sarah's wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, just as I'd prayed it would. The morning was a whirlwind of activity, hair appointments, last-minute decorations, helping Sarah into her dress. She looked absolutely radiant, and for a few hours I forgot about my worries. This was my daughter's perfect day, and nothing was going to ruin it. The ceremony was everything I'd dreamed it would be. Sarah walked down the aisle on Jim's arm, and even he seemed moved by the moment. David's face when he saw her, that's the kind of love story I'd always believed in. The vows were beautiful, personal, full of promise and hope. For those 30 minutes, I felt like everything in my world was exactly as it should be. The reception started perfectly, too. The band was wonderful, the food was delicious, everyone was having a great time. I felt proud, accomplished. I'd given my daughter a beautiful wedding, but then I started noticing little things. Emma was there. Jim had insisted she be invited since she'd helped with some of the business-related guest arrangements. She looked stunning in a red dress that seemed a little too attention-grabbing for someone else's wedding. I watched Jim throughout the evening, and I saw how his eyes kept finding her across the room. How they shared looks that seemed too intimate for a boss and his secretary. How she touched his arm when she spoke to him, lingering just a moment too long. How he laughed at things she said with a warmth I hadn't heard from him in years. I tried to push these thoughts away. This was Sarah's day. I needed to focus on being the perfect mother of the bride. But the knot in my stomach grew tighter with each passing hour. Each shared glance between Jim and Emma. Each moment I felt like I was watching my husband fall in love with another woman right in front of me. It happened during the father-daughter dance. Sarah and Jim were on the floor, and she was looking up at him with such love and admiration. I was standing at the edge of the dance floor with my camera, capturing what I thought would be precious memories. That's when Emma appeared beside me. She didn't say hello. She just stood there watching them dance with this strange smile on her face. Finally, she turned to me and said, "He's going to tell you tonight, you know, after all the guests leave. He didn't want to ruin Sarah's day, but he can't wait any longer." I looked at her, confused, and asked what she was talking about. That's when she said it, with that smug little smile, "He's leaving you." For me, the world stopped. The music kept playing, couples kept dancing, people kept laughing and talking. But I felt like I was watching it all from underwater. Emma kept talking, telling me about their relationship, how long it had been going on, how Jim had been planning to leave me for months but wanted to wait until after the wedding. She was so casual about it, like she was discussing the weather. Then the dance ended, and Jim walked back toward us. He looked at Emma first, not at me, and she gave him a small nod. That's when I knew she wasn't lying. Jim took my arm and guided me to a quiet corner of the reception hall. He looked nervous, guilty, but also determined. And then he said those words that shattered everything, "Ethel. I need to tell you something. I found someone new." And then he said those words that shattered everything, "Ethel. I need to tell you something. I found someone new." You'd think that after 32 years of marriage you'd know when something's wrong, right? But no. My husband Jim had gotten so good at pretending everything was fine that even I couldn't see it coming. Or maybe I just refused to see it, but there it was, finally out in the open, in the middle of my own daughter's wedding reception of all places. In front of everyone who mattered to us, Jim didn't just tell me he was leaving. He announced it. Not intentionally, maybe, but loud enough that several people nearby heard. The conversation stopped spreading outward like ripples on a pond. Within minutes, everyone at the reception knew that Jim had just told his wife of 32 years that he was leaving her for his secretary. I watched people's faces change as they processed what they were hearing. Some looked shocked, others embarrassed for me. A few seemed almost excited by the drama. I saw Sarah's face across the room when someone whispered the news to her. Her beautiful wedding day smile crumbled, and she started toward us, but David held her back. This was no time for a family confrontation. Everyone expected me to cry, right? Or shout, to make a scene, to slap him, to do something dramatic. But no, I stood there calm. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Instead, I smiled. I smiled because deep down I knew something he didn't. The game had changed. This wasn't just about him leaving me. This was about me leaving him behind. I looked at Emma, standing there with her satisfied smile, thinking she'd won some great prize. Then I looked at Jim, fidgeting with his tie, waiting for my reaction. And I realized something profound. I wasn't devastated. I was relieved. All those months of feeling ignored, of making excuses, of pretending everything was fine, it was finally over. The pretense could finally end. So I said the only thing that felt true in that moment. Well, Jim, I guess that makes things easier for both of us. The look on his face was priceless. He'd expected tears, begging, a fight for our marriage. He'd gotten steel instead. I turned to Emma and said, "Congratulations. You're getting a man who's very good at keeping secrets. I hope you're comfortable with that." And then I walked away. I didn't leave that night, but I didn't stay either. I walked out of that reception, head high, leaving Jim to explain to everyone what had just happened. Let him try to manage the social fallout of humiliating his wife at their daughter's wedding. I went home, took off my mother of the bride dress, and sat in my living room in the dark, thinking. The strange thing was, I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry yet. I felt empty but also strangely clear-headed. All those years of trying to be the perfect wife, of pretending not to notice the signs, of making excuses for his behavior. I was finally free from all of that. I could stop pretending, but I also realized something else. Jim thought he held all the cards. He thought I was this helpless housewife who would be lost without him. What he didn't know was that while he'd been sneaking around with Emma, I'd been paying attention. Very close attention. See, here's the thing they didn't know. I wasn't just a stay-at-home wife. I wasn't some fragile woman who needed saving. I had been quietly watching, learning, and gathering everything I needed to turn this around. I was the one who handled the finances for years. I balanced the checkbooks, managed the investments, filed the taxes. I knew every account, every asset, every penny we owned. I also knew about the account Jim thought he'd hidden from me, the one he'd been using to fund his affair. The expensive dinners, the hotel rooms, the jewelry that certainly never made it home to me. That night, while Jim was probably explaining himself to Emma or trying to smooth things over with Sarah and David, I was in his study, gathering documents, bank statements, investment records, credit card bills, tax returns. I made copies of everything. By morning, I had a complete picture of our financial life and proof of exactly how he'd been spending our money on his affair. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and meetings. Sarah was devastated, torn between anger at her father and worry about me. Michael flew in from California, ready to confront Jim, but I asked him to stay out of it. This was my battle to fight, and I was going to fight it smart. My first call was to Margaret Patterson, the best divorce attorney in town. I'd known her socially for years. She was married to one of Jim's golf partners. She was sharp, ruthless, and had a reputation for getting her clients exactly what they deserved. When I walked into her office with my box of financial documents, her eyes lit up. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, "you've done my job for me. This is the most organized presentation of marital assets I've ever seen." She was particularly interested in Jim's secret account and the pattern of spending that clearly showed he'd been funding an affair. In our state, that kind of financial deception could be grounds for a very favorable settlement. But I didn't want just a favorable settlement. I wanted justice. I wanted him to understand that there were consequences for throwing away 32 years of marriage like it meant nothing. Margaret and I developed a strategy. We would file for divorce on grounds of adultery and financial deception. We would demand the house, half of all assets, and substantial alimony, and we would make sure Emma's role in breaking up our marriage was well documented. But first, we needed to make sure Jim couldn't hide any more assets or try to transfer money to Emma. Margaret filed an emergency motion to freeze all of our accounts. Within 48 hours of Sarah's wedding, Jim found out he couldn't access his secret account, couldn't make any large financial transactions, and couldn't hide any more money from me. Jim came home 3 days after the wedding, sheepish and apologetic, expecting to find me devastated and willing to negotiate. Instead, he found me sitting at the dining room table with a cup of coffee and a manila envelope. He looked tired, probably from dealing with the fallout at work and explaining to his family and friends why he'd chosen his daughter's wedding to blow up his marriage. "Ethel," he started, "we need to talk about how we're going to handle this. I know you're hurt, but we can work out something fair." I let him finish his little speech about how we could be civilized about this, how we didn't need lawyers, how we could divide things amicably and keep it quiet. When he was done, I slid the envelope across the table to him. "Open it," I said. Inside were the divorce papers, the financial records, and copies of all his credit card statements showing every dinner, every hotel room, every gift he'd bought for Emma with our money. I watched his face change as he realized what he was looking at. "You see, Jim," I said, "you thought I didn't know about Emma, about the account, about all the lies you've been telling, but I knew. I've known for months. I just chose not to confront you because I kept hoping you'd come to your senses and choose your family. But when you decided to humiliate me at our daughter's wedding, you made the choice for both of us." He tried to argue, to minimize what he'd done, to blame our marriage problems on me, but I cut him off. "Jim, You forfeited the right to negotiate when you decided to spend our money on your affair. You forfeited the right to ask for fairness when you chose to destroy our daughter's wedding to make your announcement. And you forfeited the right to expect civility when you brought your mistress to our family celebration and let her tell me about your plans. These papers are not a negotiation. They're a notification. You have 30 days to respond through your attorney. And Jim? You might want to call Emma and let her know that her boyfriend is about to become a lot less wealthy than she thought. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of depositions, document reviews, and court appearances. Jim hired his own attorney, a friend from the country club who specialized in helping wealthy men protect their assets in divorce. But Margaret was better, and we had the evidence. It turned out that Jim's affair with Emma had been going on for over a year, and he'd spent nearly $50,000 of our money on it. Hotel rooms in expensive resorts, jewelry, expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never seen. He'd even bought her a car, a red convertible that he'd somehow convinced himself was a business expense. But the real revelation came during Emma's deposition. Under oath, she admitted that Jim had promised to leave me within 6 months of hiring her. She had phone records, emails, and text messages that showed he'd been planning his exit strategy long before he ever told me. She'd even helped him open the secret bank account, using her address to hide the statements from me. The judge was not impressed with Jim's behavior. A man who would use his daughter's wedding to announce his affair, who would hide marital assets, and who would bring his mistress to family events, was not someone who deserved sympathy or favorable treatment. Margaret was brilliant in court. She painted a picture of a devoted wife who had given up her career to support her husband's success, only to be betrayed and humiliated when he decided to trade her in for a younger model. She showed how I'd been the one managing our household finances, making our social connections, and supporting his business relationships for decades. In the end, I got the house, 60% of our assets, substantial alimony, and my legal fees paid. Jim got his freedom, and the realization that it had cost him nearly everything he'd worked for. Emma got a man who was now significantly less wealthy, and who had proven he was willing to lie and cheat when it suited him. The day the divorce was finalized, I sat in my lawyer's office signing the final papers, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future. For the first time in decades, I had no idea what came next, and instead of terrifying me, it felt liberating. I drove home to my house now, and walked through every room, seeing it differently. This wasn't the home Jim and I had built together anymore. This was my space, my sanctuary, my fresh start. I could paint the walls any color I wanted. I could rearrange the furniture. I could get rid of everything that reminded me of him and keep only what brought me joy. The first thing I did was redecorate his study. That room had always been his domain, filled with his business awards and golf trophies and pictures of handshakes with important clients. I turned it into an art studio. I bought easels and paints and canvases. I'd always loved art but had never had time to pursue it seriously. Well, now I had nothing but time. I also joined a divorce support group at the community center. I'd been dreading it, expecting to find a room full of bitter women complaining about their ex-husbands. Instead, I found a group of strong, resilient women who were rebuilding their lives with courage and creativity. There was Linda, who'd gone back to school to become a nurse at 58. There was Patricia, who'd started her own catering business. There was Janet, who'd moved to Italy for 6 months just because she'd always wanted to. These women became my inspiration and my support system. They celebrated my victories and listened to my fears. They reminded me that divorce wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. They helped me see that I wasn't defined by being Jim's wife or Sarah and Michael's mother. I was Ethel, and I had value all by myself. The hardest part wasn't dealing with Jim or the legal proceedings. It was learning how to be alone without being lonely. I'd been part of a couple for so long that I'd forgotten who I was as an individual. I had to relearn simple things like what I wanted to eat for dinner when I was the only one eating it, what television shows I actually enjoyed, what time I preferred to go to bed. But slowly, I began to remember the woman I'd been before marriage and children. I remembered that I'd loved to read mystery novels, that I'd enjoyed trying new recipes, that I'd once dreamed of traveling to places Jim had never been interested in visiting. I made lists of things I wanted to do, places I wanted to see, experiences I wanted to have. I signed up for art classes at the local college. I was terrible at first. My hands weren't steady. My sense of color was rusty, and I was intimidated by the younger students who seemed so naturally talented. But my instructor, a wonderful woman named Elena, reminded me that art wasn't about perfection. It was about expression, about finding joy in creation. I painted terrible paintings for months, but gradually they got better. More importantly, I got better. I learned to see colors and shadows I'd never noticed before. I learned to trust my instincts instead of constantly seeking approval. I learned that it was okay to create something just for the joy of creating it, not because anyone else would ever see it or judge it. I also started traveling. Small trips at first, a weekend in Chicago to visit museums, a week in Colorado to see the fall foliage. Then bigger adventures. I went to Paris by myself, something I'd dreamed of doing since college, but Jim had never been interested in. I walked along the Seine, visited the Louvre, sat in cafes and sketched strangers. I felt sophisticated and independent and fully alive. My relationship with Sarah and Michael evolved during this time too. Initially, they were both angry with their father and protective of me, but I had to help them understand that I didn't want them choosing sides. Jim was still their father, and I wouldn't be the kind of ex-wife who poisoned their relationship with him. That didn't mean I protected him from the natural consequences of his choices. When he missed Michael's birthday because he was on vacation with Emma, I didn't make excuses for him. When he forgot to send Sarah a card on the anniversary of her wedding, the wedding he'd ruined with his announcement, I didn't remind him. I let him be responsible for his own relationships. It was interesting to watch how people in our social circle reacted to the divorce. Some friends disappeared entirely, uncomfortable with the disruption to their neat couple's world. Others rallied around me with fierce loyalty. A few tried to maintain relationships with both of us, which led to some awkward moments at community events. The most fascinating reaction was from other wives in similar situations. Women I'd known for years began calling me, sometimes months after the divorce was final, to ask how I'd known about Jim's affair, how I'd prepared for the divorce, what signs they should be watching for in their own marriages. I realized I'd become an inadvertent expert in recognizing infidelity and protecting yourself from financial betrayal. That's when I started thinking about helping other women in similar situations. I had learned so much about protecting assets, gathering evidence, and building a strong legal case. I'd also learned about the emotional journey of rebuilding your identity after a long marriage ends. Maybe there was a way to use that knowledge to help others. 2 years after my divorce was finalized, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I started a business. Not just any business. A consulting service for women going through divorce. I called it Second Chances, and my mission was to help women protect themselves financially and emotionally during one of the most difficult times in their lives. I partnered with Margaret Patterson and 2 other divorce attorneys to offer workshops on financial preparation, evidence gathering, and legal rights. I also worked with therapists and career counselors to address the emotional and practical challenges of starting over later in life. We covered everything from how to document hidden assets to how to update your resume after 20 years out of the workforce. The response was overwhelming. Women came from all over the state to attend our workshops. Some were already in the middle of divorce proceedings and needed immediate help. Others were just starting to suspect their husbands of cheating and wanted to know how to protect themselves. A few were simply preparing for the possibility, having learned from friends' experiences. What I loved most about the business was the empowerment aspect. These women came to us feeling helpless, confused, and afraid. They left with knowledge, tools, and confidence. We taught them how to access their own credit reports, how to photograph important documents, how to establish their own credit history, how to value businesses and investments. But more than the practical advice, we gave them something even more valuable. The knowledge that they were not alone, that they were stronger than they thought, and that their lives could be better after divorce than they'd ever been during marriage. We celebrated their successes, new jobs, new homes, new relationships, new adventures. Running Second Chances also helped me process my own experience. Every woman who walked into our office reminded me of myself 3 years earlier, scared, angry, but ultimately ready to fight for a better future. Helping them helped me continue to heal and grow. I need to tell you about Robert, because you might be wondering if this story has a romantic subplot. It does, but not in the way you'd expect. I met Robert at an art class 3 years after my divorce. He was a widower, retired from teaching high school history, and he painted landscapes with a gentle precision that I admired. We started as friends, bonding over our shared status as people starting over later in life. He'd lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier after 41 years of marriage, and he was navigating his own journey of rediscovering who he was as an individual. We understood each other's grief and growth in ways that people who'd never experienced long marriages couldn't. Our romance, if you can call it that, developed slowly. Coffee after art class became lunch, which became dinner, which became weekend trips to art museums and local festivals. He was patient with my wariness about relationships, understanding that trust didn't come easily after betrayal. I was patient with his grief, understanding that love after loss is complicated. What I loved about Robert was that he never tried to fix me or complete me. He appreciated the woman I'd become, independent, strong, creative, purposeful. He didn't want me to give up my business or my travels or my newly discovered sense of self. He wanted to add to my life, not replace it. We've been together for 2 years now, and we've chosen not to marry or even live together permanently. We both value our independence too much, and we've both learned that legal and financial entanglement doesn't guarantee emotional connection. Instead, we've built something different. A partnership based on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine affection. Robert has taught me that there's a difference between needing someone and choosing to be with them. With Jim, I'd needed the security, the social status, the sense of completion that marriage provided. With Robert, I choose to share my time and my heart because it makes both of our lives richer. You might be wondering what happened to Jim and Emma. Well, their story unfolded exactly as you might expect. The affair that had seemed so exciting and passionate when it was secret became just another relationship when it was out in the open. Without the thrill of sneaking around and the challenge of keeping secrets, they discovered they didn't actually have much in common. Emma, it turned out, had been attracted to Jim's success and financial stability more than his personality. When the divorce settlement significantly reduced his wealth, and when he had to sell his business to pay the legal fees and settlement, he became much less appealing. The red convertible he'd bought her was repossessed when he couldn't keep up the payments. They lasted about 18 months after our divorce was finalized. Jim found out she'd been job hunting and dating other men for the last 6 months of their relationship. She found out he'd been lying about his financial prospects and had accumulated significant debt trying to maintain the lifestyle she expected. I learned all this not because I was keeping tabs on them, but because we live in a small city and news travels. Sarah told me some of it, having heard it from friends who still worked with Jim. Michael mentioned seeing Jim at a grocery store, looking older and more tired than his 57 years. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy, just a kind of detached observation of how choices have consequences. Jim tried to contact me a few times during his breakup with Emma. Not to reconcile, we both knew that. Bridge was thoroughly burned, but I think he wanted to apologize, or maybe just to talk to someone who'd known him when he was a better man. I didn't respond to his calls or emails. I'd moved past needing his apology or explanation. The truth is, watching Jim's life fall apart didn't give me the satisfaction I thought it would. It just reinforced my belief that happiness built on lies and betrayal is never sustainable. He'd thrown away a solid marriage and a stable life for something that was ultimately an illusion. I felt sorry for him, but from a distance. What I hadn't expected was how my transformation would affect other people in my life. My strength in handling the divorce, my success in starting over, and my obvious happiness in my new life sent ripples through our social circle that continued for years. 3 women from my neighborhood asked me to help them investigate suspicious behavior from their husbands. 2 of them discovered affairs and filed for divorce, armed with the knowledge I'd shared about protecting assets and gathering evidence. The 3rd discovered that her husband wasn't cheating. He was planning a surprise renewal of their wedding, vows for their 25th anniversary. Also inspired some unexpected changes in long-term marriages. Friends who'd been going through the motions started having difficult conversations about what they really wanted from their relationships. Some couples separated. Others went to counseling and emerged stronger. A few decided to take the risks they'd been avoiding. Travel, career changes, moves to new cities. Sarah told me that watching me rebuild my life had changed her perspective on her own marriage. She and David had been taking their relationship for granted, assuming that love was enough to sustain them without effort or attention. Seeing how quickly a marriage could fall apart made them more intentional about nurturing their connection. Michael said something similar. He'd been working too many hours, missing family dinners, prioritizing his career over his relationships, following the same pattern his father had. Watching Jim lose everything that mattered made Michael reassess his priorities and make different choices. I realized that my divorce hadn't just changed my life. It had become a cautionary tale, a source of inspiration and a catalyst for growth in the lives of people around me. That was both humbling and empowering. 5 years after the divorce, I had to face a difficult truth. I hadn't been entirely blameless in the breakdown of my marriage. Not in the sense that I'd deserved Jim's betrayal or that I'd caused his affair, but in the sense that I'd stopped growing, stopped challenging myself, stopped being an interesting partner long before he started looking elsewhere. For years, I'd been angry about how Jim had treated me, and that anger was justified. But underneath the anger was a deeper sadness about how I'd treated myself. I'd made myself smaller and smaller, year after year, until I'd almost disappeared. I'd stopped having opinions about anything more controversial than dinner plans. I'd stopped pursuing interests that Jim didn't share. I'd stopped being curious about the world beyond our comfortable suburban bubble. This realization didn't excuse Jim's behavior or make me regret the divorce, but it helped me understand why our marriage had been dying long before Emma came along. We'd both stopped putting energy into our relationship, stopped growing as individuals, stopped challenging each other to be better. We'd become roommates who shared expenses and social obligations but had forgotten how to be companions. Understanding this helped me commit even more deeply to continued growth and self-discovery. I never wanted to become complacent again. Never wanted to wake up one day and realize I'd been sleepwalking through my life. I made a promise to myself to keep taking risks, keep learning new things, keep pushing myself out of my comfort zone. This commitment led me to make some bold choices. I sold the house, our house, and bought a smaller place that was entirely my own. I traveled to places that scared me a little. I took advanced art classes that challenged my skills. I expanded second chances to include online workshops that reached women across the country. 6 years after the divorce, Jim and I found ourselves at the same place at the same time for the first time since the legal proceedings ended. Michael's daughter, my granddaughter Emma, ironically named, was graduating from high school, and both of us wanted to be there for this important milestone. I'd been dreading this moment for months. Sarah and Michael had been worried about it too, afraid there would be tension or awkwardness that would overshadow Emma's big day. But when I saw Jim across the auditorium, I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not nostalgia. Just a mild recognition, like seeing a former neighbor or an old colleague. He looked older, grayer, more tired than his 63 years. He was alone. Emma was long gone, and he hadn't found anyone else willing to take on a man with his track record and diminished resources. He caught my eye and nodded politely, and I nodded back. We were civilized strangers united only by our love for our granddaughter. After the ceremony at the family gathering, we even spoke briefly. He asked about my business, and I told him it was going well. I asked about his health, and he said he was managing. We talked about Emma's college plans and how proud we were of her achievements. It was the kind of pleasant, superficial conversation you might have with anyone. What struck me was how completely I'd moved past any need for his validation or apology. I didn't need him to acknowledge how badly he'd treated me or to express regret for his choices. His opinion of me, good or bad, simply didn't matter anymore. I'd found my own sense of worth, and it wasn't dependent on anything he thought or felt. I think that conversation was good for both of us. It proved that we could coexist peacefully in our children's lives without drama or conflict. It also made clear that we were completely different people now, that the people who had been married for 32 years no longer existed. As I look back on this journey, from betrayed wife to independent woman, I see patterns and lessons that I want to share, especially with other women who might be facing similar challenges or who want to avoid the mistakes I made. First, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong in your relationship, investigate rather than making excuses. I spent months explaining away Jim's behavior because I was afraid of what I might discover. But ignorance doesn't protect you. It just leaves you unprepared when the truth finally comes out. Second, maintain your own identity throughout your marriage. Don't become so focused on being a good wife and mother that you forget to be yourself. Keep your interests, your friendships, your dreams. A healthy relationship should enhance who you are, not replace who you are. Third, stay informed about your finances. I was lucky that I'd been managing our money and knew where everything was. But I've met too many women who discovered during divorce proceedings that they knew nothing about their family's financial situation. Know what you own, what you owe, and where everything is located. Fourth, build and maintain your own support network. Don't rely entirely on your spouse for emotional support or social connection. Have friends who are yours, not just couple friends. Have interests and activities that don't revolve around your family. But most importantly, remember that it's never too late to start over. I was 55 when my life fell apart, and I thought my best years were behind me. Instead, these past 7 years have been the most authentic, purposeful, and joyful years of my life. I'm more myself now than I ever was as Jim's wife. Today, as I prepare to turn 62, I'm planning my biggest adventure yet. Robert and I are spending 6 months in Tuscany, where I'll paint landscapes, and he'll research a book he's writing about Renaissance art. We're renting a small villa, and I've already arranged for local art instruction and language lessons. Second Chances is thriving under the management of 2 amazing women I hired and trained. We've helped over 300 women navigate divorce and rebuild their lives. We've expanded to offer career counseling, financial planning, and even art therapy. What started as my personal healing journey has become a resource for women across the country. Sarah and David are expecting their second child, a boy this time, and they've asked me to help with childcare when he arrives. Michael and his family are moving closer to home, partly so his daughters can have a stronger relationship with their grandmother. My relationships with my children are deeper and more honest than they ever were when I was trying to be the perfect mother. I've also become a mentor to younger women in my art classes and business workshops. They seem amazed by my confidence and independence, and they often ask how I found the courage to start over so late in life. I tell them the same thing I'm telling you. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear. The woman who stood in that reception hall 7 years ago, hearing her husband announce his affair, was terrified. She was terrified of being alone, of not having enough money, of what people would think, of whether she was strong enough to survive. But she was also tired of pretending, tired of making excuses, tired of living a lie. That terror and exhaustion became the fuel for transformation. Every time I was afraid of trying something new, I reminded myself that staying stuck was more frightening than taking risks. Every time I doubted my abilities, I proved to myself that I was stronger than I thought. So here I am, no longer Aunt Ethel who's defined by her relationships to other people, but Ethel who's defined by her own choices, her own values, her own dreams. I've learned that endings aren't really endings at all. Sometimes, they're just the beginning of something much better, something you never even thought was possible. To anyone out there who's stuck in a situation where you feel invisible, where you're making excuses for someone else's bad behavior, where you've forgotten who you are underneath all the roles you play, know this: it's never too late to take control of your own life. It's never too late to choose yourself. Don't wait for someone else to give you permission to be happy. Don't wait for the perfect moment, or until you feel completely ready. Don't wait until you're not afraid anymore. Take that first step while you're still scared, still uncertain, still doubted by others and yourself. Your life is not a dress rehearsal. This is it. The only chance you get to be authentically, boldly, unapologetically yourself. Don't waste it trying to be what other people want you to be, or staying in situations that make you smaller instead of larger. Yes, starting over is hard. Yes, there will be people who don't understand or support your choices. Yes, there will be moments when you question whether you're doing the right thing. But I promise you this. The fear of change is almost always worse than change itself. 7 years ago, I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was to survive the humiliation and disappointment and maybe find some small measure of peace. Instead, I found joy, purpose, adventure, and a version of myself I never knew existed. I found love again, but more importantly, I found self-love. I found success in business, but more importantly, I found meaning in helping others. I found independence, but more importantly, I found the strength to choose interdependence with people who deserve my time and energy. That night at Sarah's wedding, when Jim announced he was leaving me for another woman, he thought he was ending my story. Instead, he was just turning the page to a new chapter, one where I'm the author, not just a supporting character in someone else's narrative. And if a 55-year-old woman who hadn't worked outside the home in decades, who had never lived alone, who thought her best years were behind her can completely reinvent her life, then anyone can. The only question is, are you ready to turn the page and start writing your own new chapter? Trust me on this. That first step, it's worth it. It's absolutely worth it.